we'll create a new attribute off of an existing event with Custom Data Designer. This will be used for something like page level items that are knowable when the page first loads, but might be custom items that are not yet represented in Apollo. In this case, perhaps we want to track a Salesforce user ID that we know as the page loads, but isn't already built in. So from the design screen, I'll hit Create New. And on my requirement name, this is the business question that I'm trying to answer. And I'll fill out a description as well. As before, we'll leave this area empty and we'll fill out the rest of the required fields first. So site feature, I'll find the one that matches best. And then I'll choose freeform table as my report type. Again, the flow report type is for things like props where you want to see values over time, and freeform table is for most everything else and is going to be much more commonly used. And this is what will make it into Workspace if the dashboards are created through Apollo and sent into Analysis Workspace. We'll again choose our scope. So you have the options of property, organization, and only select people may see the other items. Property and organization are the most common that you'll see. And choosing the property level will allow this to be available just for this instance of Apollo. If we have other properties under the same organization that we might also want to be able to access this item, we would choose organization. So I'll choose that. I'll hit save and continue. Then we'll ultimately be creating something new, a new combination of an event and attribute. It's just that the event part of that already exists. So we'll hit create new, and we'll search events for the page load started event, which is already something that is in the system and enabled. So we'll hit the plus next to that, save and continue. And on the screen, we see off of page load started, there's already a large number of attributes, but we want to add a new one. So we'll hit create new again for the attribute itself. And we'll call this Salesforce ID. And hit save and continue. And by default, this is also at the organization level since that's the scope that we selected initially. And generally, you want all of the objects under the requirement to match in scope. So now we see our new Salesforce ID attribute, in addition to all of the other items that we're already firing with page load started. So we'll hit save and continue, and we'll confirm. And now we see our new Salesforce ID attribute off of the page load started event. We'll hit continue and verify. And then we see that we need to fill out a data source and a variable. So we want this to come from a location in the data layer. So we'll hit add data source, and then we'll create a new data source. And this represents the data layer location itself. We'll put the exact path in a moment. And then we'll put data layer as our data source type. And our data layer path, we can look at the existing structure of our data layer under design and data sources. And in the data layer section, we see that we already have a user object with one item under it. And since this is an attribute about the user, we'll map it to the existing top level user object. The app event data level is implied at the property level, so we don't have to type the top level name of the data layer, just the item underneath that. So we're going to start with user and then Salesforce ID. We don't need a containing array in this case because there is no array needed in this item. There's just a single Salesforce ID that applies to the user. For items that do require arrays, if you mouse over the information icons, you can see the structure that you would need to use for those. It's important that the data layer path and the type of variable that you're using match together. So for example, if you're using any type of merchandising EVAR, for example, a product syntax merchandising EVAR, that would require that you have an array structure. Whereas for a regular EVAR, generally you're just going to have a straight data layer path. So it's important to think through the entire architecture. And if you're not experienced in Adobe Analytics configuration, work with somebody who has done Adobe Analytics architecture to make the appropriate selections. Then we choose our value type. In this case, we want it to be a string. Even though the ID is a number, we don't want it to be numeric in a data type sense. So we're going to choose string. And then if we knew that, for example, this ID was always a hash value that had a certain number of characters, we could put a minimum and maximum length here. If it was an item that always matched a particular structure, for example, we knew that there was always a prefix and then a particular number of letters and numbers, then we could represent that using regular expression. So any validation items that you fill in these fields will trigger console errors if the conditions are not met. And then those errors will forward on to error breaks. So you can proactively catch issues with your data. It won't prevent the Adobe Analytics call from firing as it otherwise would, provided that the call itself is valid, but you will get real-time feedback on whether any of these conditions are violated, so you know if you have data quality issues. Then we'll put an example of what this ID looks like. Of course, it would be more complex than 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, but we'll put this example here. This will make it into the documentation that the developers see, as well as some other SDR documentation that gets created in Apollo. So you want these examples to be real and valid in a true use case. So we'll hit save and continue. And we'll hit save and continue again, since we just needed to create the one data source. And ultimately, we'll map it to a variable. So we want this to be an EVAR in this case that would track Salesforce ID. So I'll hit add variable. And there's not an existing one, so I'll hit create new. And this is the name of the variable that actually gets created in Adobe Analytics. And I have a couple of options here. So I'm going to track this as an EVAR, but perhaps we just wanted to report this information into a pixel. In that case, we would choose third party if we didn't want it to be in Adobe Analytics, but we did want it to update the data layer. And we'll show a subsequent example of that in another video. But for now, I'm just going to choose that I want it to be an EVAR. I want it to be a text string with most recent last allocation and visit expiration. And again, if you're not aware of the implications of these settings, work with an experienced architect to help you. Hit save and continue. And save and continue again. And now we have our full tracking item, which includes our requirement name, which is the business question, our description, the triggering data layer event, which is page load started, the attribute that we want to collect, which is the Salesforce ID, the fact that it's coming from the data layer, and reporting into an EVAR. So these are all of the attributes that we need for a complete business requirement. So we'll save this, and we'll note that it says incomplete. This won't be available for live selection until we mark it complete. This is a final action, so if you need to do further editing, you don't want to mark it complete yet. It is possible to get back to this by using this rightmost menu and searching for design incomplete from this menu. And if we scroll down, we can see this is our requirement that we started to build. If we hit view details and we need to continue editing or adjusting, we can go back to the edit mode by hitting this edit button. And if we did try to enable it before design was complete, we mouse over this and we see requirement design is not complete. So we do have to enable it first in order to use it. So once we've marked it design complete and enabled it, it will work just like any other business requirement in the system. It will update our data layer documentation with a new attribute available on the page load started event of Salesforce ID. It will update our data layer documentation with the new location in the data layer. Anna will update our Adobe Analytics configuration by creating this Salesforce IDE var, and we can assign it to a specific variable in the Assign Custom Variables step.